to be here, and I just want to say welcome to everyone. As a Reform rabbi, we're always saying Shechianu this, Shechianu that. I want to say a Shechianu moment for the fact that this is a Jewish event, and the first row is basically entirely full, which is just so awesome, and shows you what it takes to meet the threshold of being a Shechianu moment. So here we go. I want to speak to you guys tonight as a Jewish educator. You know, that's really it. And I want to do something that's pretty self-serving in that respect, which is I want to tell a story where the hero of the story is a Jewish educator. You know, it's not very often that you encounter stories that have as their protagonist either an educator or a Jewish educator. In fact, a book that comes to mind that I read over the summer is called The Cannibal Galaxy. It's by Cynthia Ozick, and that's a book where the main character is a Jewish educator, but I would suggest that he's an anti-hero, not even a hero. So that's the only piece of literature that I can think of that actually has a Jewish educator as the dominant character, and that's not a very flattering portrayal. But I think it becomes a little less self-serving if you'll join me in assuming the mantle of being a fellow Jewish educator, because I would suggest that not only those of us who have the privilege of teaching children and adults and young adults and bringing them closer to Jewish tradition meet the criteria of being a Jewish educator, but that certainly parents and grandparents and all sorts of people who are involved in the enterprise of making Judaism relevant in the world today are Jewish educators. So this is a story that hopefully engages all of us as heroes. Now, being a hero doesn't really actually do much for us because we know from good storytelling that heroes, it's not all glory, right? Every hero undergoes some sort of learning journey, and there are pains and conflict that are associated with going on that journey. And so what I want to try to do is start us in a low place and hopefully come to a place where there's some sort of resolution of a conflict, one that I've experienced. And all I'm going to do is try to make transparent a little bit of just one thought bubble, really one thought process that has been of interest to me recently. And so, you know, we'll give it a shot and we'll see how it goes. I want to just ask everyone to take a moment at this very interesting hour for Jewish reflection and come up with a mental image, just the first image that comes into your mind when I say the word burden. B-U-R-D-E-N, burden. Think about how that word makes you feel. I would imagine, when I think of burden, I'll just share, I think of things like national debt, right, or taxes, or something that weighs heavily on me, something that doesn't inspire me or uplift me, but makes me feel a sense of weightiness and isn't necessarily something that I look forward to. I don't look forward to the burdens in my day as much as I look forward to the triumphs and the celebrations and the simchas and the joyful moments. And I think, most people probably feel about burden the way that I feel about burden. And I feel that our image of what constitutes a burden is something that we share being participants in Western civilization because it comes from Greek mythology, from one of two places, two characters in Greek mythology. The first one would be Atlas, right? So Atlas is the person who is sustaining not the world, I learned from Wikipedia, thank God, but the heavens on his shoulders, right? He has this overwhelming burden that he can't possibly fulfill. And, God forbid a fly should land on Atlas's nose, right? Because the whole thing would come crashing down. It's this weight that he can't possibly sustain. So that's the first image that I think influences our understanding, our conception of burden. The second one is Sisyphus. All right, now Sisyphus has a wonderful task, right? For those of us who are familiar, I see some people nodding. Sisyphus' job for all eternity is to roll a massive boulder up a hill and then have it come down the minute he gets to the top. This is P90X on steroids, right? For all eternity, to roll this boulder up the hill, it gets to the top, down it goes again, over and over and over again. And so for Sisyphus, the burden is something that is completely devoid of any meaning or any purpose or any resolution, right? So Atlas, your burden is something that is unbearably heavy. It crushes you. You can't step away from it for even a second. In Sisyphus, there's no meaning, there's no purpose, endless repetition, insanity, meaninglessness, muscles, right? Okay, so I feel, and I may be wrong, but it's something that I've encountered and something I know from my own upbringing, my own encounters as a student in Jewish education, that when people think about Judaism in the world today, Jews, they tend to think very quickly, their mind goes to that place of burden. Judaism is a burden, and we know that we're busier than we've ever been. We have more things competing for our time and our resources than we've ever had before, and we seem to have increasingly less and less time. Many of us are leading these dual lives, right? We've got our Facebook and our Twitter. There's just so much going on, and for many Jews, Judaism manifests itself primarily as a burden. Either it's something that, you know what, if I'm not going to go all the way in, then there's no point in doing it. Right? If I'm not going to do Shabbat and the holidays and study Hebrew and be a Zionist, then there's no point, right? It's a burden. It's something that I can't possibly sustain. I can't uphold with integrity. Or it's something that, you know what, I go, but I don't find any meaning. I find it to be void of relevance and so on and so forth. And so consequently, it's a burden that just isn't worth the investment of my time. And I think that's sort of what Mordecai Kaplan was describing a long time ago in 1934 when he wrote these words. In the opening paragraphs of Judaism as a Civilization. Before the beginning of the 19th century, all Jews regarded Judaism as a privilege. Since then, most Jews have come to regard it as a burden. Dr. Stein, earlier this evening, reminded us of the tremendous amount of history that has unfolded since Kaplan wrote these words. I think it's staggering that this notion of burden is something that has endured the tribulations and the magnificent and miraculous nature of modern Jewish history. But I think it does endure to some extent. So coming to Jewish educators, right, we've inherited a situation where we're passionate about something. We have cast our lot with the Jewish people. We believe that it's important. We believe that it's relevant, and we find that there's a disconnect. The people that we encounter, we know, are interested at the school that I work at. Well, how many hours a day is there going to be Jewish studies? How many hours a day will there be Hebrew? At what expense? And you know, I know that once people get invested in it, they find the meaning and they find the relevance. But initially, there is that question of, is this a burden? Is this something that's going to detract from my ability to fulfill my other responsibilities, to study other subjects, and so on and so forth? And so I know for a fact that one response that Jewish educators take to this question of burden is to figure out, are there ways that we can lighten the load of Judaism? Are there ways that we can, with integrity, lighten the burden? Can we really put an emphasis on Friday night, perhaps at the expense of Saturday morning? Can we put an emphasis on the high holidays, perhaps at the expense of the Shlosh Regalim? And are there ways that we can compel people, when they do come to us, to find meaning in Judaism? I want to suggest that rather than trying to lighten the burden that people perceive in Judaism, we should probably go in an opposite direction and see if there's not a different way that we can think about burden that might empower us as Jewish educators to continue to present Judaism in the multivalent and rich way that we experience it and bring other people with us. And I know that we have resources within Jewish tradition that can give us support as we do this, but I want to take a step outside of Jewish tradition, and I want to move to a work called The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. Now, just a quick anecdote about where this book came from, because I didn't read a whole book to prepare for this talk, right? This was a book that I read in high school. And so the version of Unbearable Lightness of Being that I took off of my bookshelf has the notes that I took when I was a senior in high school. By way of comparison, and this is horrible, and you know, Mom, I'm sorry, the version of the Chumash with Rashi commentary that I received when I was in Hebrew school when I was in high school, I found that as well. And whereas Unbearable Lightness of Being has all these wonderful underlines and notes about existentialism and the search for meaning, et cetera, I can't believe I'm saying this in a public forum. My Chumash says, and this is, I've moved away from this, it says, in case of fire, throw this in first. Okay? So that, I think, when I think about burden, when I think about people being turned off from Judaism, I'm speaking from a place where I kept both of those books, but it's clear when I look back on who I was, what was capturing my imagination and what was compelling to me. So let's get into the quote. The heaviest of burdens is therefore simultaneously an image of life's most intense fulfillment. The heavier the burden, the closer our lives come to the earth, the more real and truthful they become. So right off the bat, we see what I would consider to be a positive conception of burden. And what I want to do, unpack this quote and make some connections to Jewish tradition. There's not going to be, I think, a neat and tidy resolution to this talk as much as I'm hoping that you'll engage in a parallel process with me of thinking through issues that we all encounter as Jewish educators in terms of making Judaism relevant and compelling. Is that okay? Awesome, thank you. So, intense fulfillment. Intense fulfillment to me speaks to what does Judaism do for me as an individual, as a human being, as someone who has these, these concerns about leading a purposeful and meaningful life. And take a moment, summon an image of what intense fulfillment is for you. In a Jewish context and not a Jewish context, it doesn't matter, right? It's what I could say that it's not what happened to me, honestly, at the Indian buffet last week, right? That's not the type of intense fulfillment that we're talking about. I'll give you a few Jewish examples from I hear people who have been to the Indian buffet as well. Guilty, right? So for me, intense fulfillment is blessing my 8-month-old daughter, Hadara, and my wife, also a rabbi, on Friday evening. That's an example of intense fulfillment. It's being at Kabbalat Shabbat at the school, at the Davis Academy where I work, and all of a sudden the entire 3rd grade jumping up during Micha Mocha and doing a flash mob with the most incredible choreography that I've ever seen in my life. Complete surprise. That's an example. It's, I know it's a cliche image, it's getting off the plane in Israel and going straight to the Kotel with 8th graders who have never been overseas, let alone been to Israel, and watching them cry and hug and sing and dance and even get swept away by Chabad and wrap tefillin and do all that other good stuff, right? That to me is intensely fulfilling. It's alumni coming back years later and not only being brilliant and good looking and charming and driving and all of that stuff, but changing the world and being committed Jews. It's just to share one more personal example. It's an interesting day for me and for my family. My grandfather, of blessed memory, Harold Lapidus, for whom my daughter is named, passed away a number of years ago. For a variety of reasons, his unveiling happened, I found out yesterday, today. And so my father sent me an email last night. We're doing Grandpa's unveiling tomorrow. Could you tell me what to do? And being able to coach my father through that experience, having the sort of cosmic alignment that leads to my being able to honor my grandfather's memory in this public forum, knowing that that happened in my family today and that that was a healing moment much needed, and knowing that I would have the opportunity to share with you. That to me is the type of intense fulfillment that I think people have a right to demand from Judaism. And as Jewish educators, we have to ask as much as possible, right? Because it's a high barrier, it's a high threshold to raise. Are we creating intensely fulfilling Jewish moments? All right, next slide. Grounded. So Kundera sits closer to the earth. I want to talk about instead, though, grounded, because I think, for me, I love this image of the cloud. I feel like we live in an era of the cloud. Everything's in the cloud, right? When's the last time you bought a CD? It's all in the cloud. It's stored somewhere else. It's unbelievably light and airy, all of the stuff that exists in the cloud. And yet Judaism, I think, asks us to be grounded. The parsha that we read on Shabbat, Shemot, we read about Moshe taking off his sandals and standing firmly on the ground. And we know that that's about having a moral stance towards reality. That's about being rooted. And so to revisit that image of Atlas, right, who's holding up the heavens, I feel the Jewish version is to turn that on its head. And so instead of this, we take off our shoes, we stand firmly planted on the ground. And that's why in that verse, Exodus 3:5, it says, Admat Kodesh, holy ground. And I think it's with great purpose and intention that the Hebrew word for human being, Adam, and the Hebrew word for earth or ground, Adamah, are the same word, right? As human beings, we are supposed to be grounded. And for me, grounded is also, whereas intense fulfillment is about this personal connection, grounded to me is about community. It's about that horizontal relationship that we enjoy with the people that we work with, fellow Jewish educators, and ultimately with an entire ecology. I feel like it needs to be said that the Hebrew word kavod, the Hebrew word kaved, which means heavy, and the Hebrew word kavod, which means honorable, also come from the same shoresh, or the same Hebrew root structure. And so in terms of this notion of ecology, I think it's significant to say, quoting Pirkei Avot, Ezehu mechubad hamechabed et habriot, who is worthy, who lives a life that is heavy and rooted and grounded and honorable, a person who honors all creation, which I think is a lovely concept. And when I think of Judaism as something that grounds us, I think of that Adam and Adamah, and I think of that kavod and kaved, and that idea of being grounded and honoring all creation through the work that we do. All right, real and truthful. So let's come back to Sisyphus, right? You've got Sisyphus, rock, Sisyphus, right? They're well acquainted. And Albert Camus, the French existential philosopher, right, who wrote all sorts of stuff, he's the one who's responsible for bringing the myth of Sisyphus, I would say, into the modern era and establishing it as the dominant metaphor, for some, of what it means to be a human being today. It means to be involved in an absurd undertaking where there is absolutely no meaning. The best we can do, to quote Camus, is to try to enjoy the struggle and to try to find some sort of happiness in it, right? So you've got Sisyphus and you've got the rock. Just as we took Atlas and turned him into Moshe, I feel like in Sisyphus's case, we take Sisyphus, he could be whoever he is, right? You know, Sisyphus, doesn't matter, right? But the rock is what I'm more interested in here, because the rock is the source of that meaningless absurdity. And some of you know where we're going. In Judaism, we also have a concept of a rock. But our rock is Sur Yisrael. It's one of the names for God. And so to be Jewish and pushing that boulder is not to be doing something that's meaningless. It's to be engaging in some sort of spiritual discovery and spiritual transformation. So far from being an absurd notion, it's something that adds, just as groundedness gives us that horizontal connection, that ecological rootedness, I would say that the idea of being real and truthful gives us a sense of connection to something that's vertical, for lack of a better spatial metaphor. Okay, so my contention is that for Judaism to be relevant and to deserve to speak moving forward, which I absolutely believe it does, it needs to be intensely fulfilling, it needs to ground us, it needs to be real and truthful, and it needs to be heavy. It needs to be thick. It needs to be rich. It needs to be uncompromising. It needs to be demanding. Because I feel, what's this image of the unbearable lightness of Judaism? Something that is unbearably light means that we can't carry it, because it's just going to float away. It's just going to evaporate if we start to go down a path of compromise. If Jewish studies becomes optional. If being a Jewish educator means, I don't know, not what it is that I'm suggesting that it can and should mean. Is this resonant? Okay. I want to come back, just as we reach a conclusion, to the second half of the quote from Milan Kundera. So he continues his quote, "Conversely, the absolute absence of burden causes man to be lighter than air, to soar into heights, take leave of the earth and his earthly being, and become only half real, his movements as free as they are insignificant. What then shall we choose?" I would say, what then shall we choose as Jewish educators? What then shall we choose, weight or lightness? I don't think anybody here is interested in Judaism that is half real, that's insignificant. That's not what brought us into Judaism, and that's not how we're going to author the next chapter. So I fall very clearly on the side of a heavy Judaism, of a thick Judaism, of a rich Judaism, and I look forward to engaging with all of you in dialogue when we meet there and figure out a little bit more clearly what that looks like. Thank you.